The words hit Ruth Crawford like a fist to the chest. She stood in the doorway of the Keating ranch house, her hair undone from its braid, her dress torn at the hem from where she had run 3 miles through scrub brush and cedar to get here. Her hands were shaking. Her throat was raw from crying, and the confession she had rehearsed 100 times on that desperate run had died completely on her tongue the moment she saw his face. Timothy Keating stood in the center of the room, his hat in his hands, his jaw tight as drawn wire. He had clearly not slept. There were dark rings beneath his pale gray eyes, and his shirt was still half untucked from the previous night, which told her he had not been to bed at all. He had been waiting. He had known she would come. She had opened her mouth. She had fully intended to say every terrible, humiliating, necessary word of it, that she had lied to him, that the letter she had shown him from her father had been forged, that the deed to the Harlan property, the one that had set all of this catastrophic machinery into motion, had never truly been hers to offer, that she had arrived in Cutter's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882 under false pretenses, and that she had let him believe things about her that were not true because she had been desperate and frightened, and certain that the truth would make every door in this territory slam shut in her face. She had opened her mouth to say all of that. But before she could apologize, he said, "There is nothing here that needs forgiving." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ruth Crawford had ever heard in her 24 years of living. She stared at him. Her lips stayed parted around the ghost of the apology she had not been allowed to deliver. Timothy set his hat down on the oak table beside him, a deliberate motion, controlled and unhurried the way he did everything. He looked at her steadily, not with the cold fury she had expected, not with the wounded betrayal she deserved. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he has been turning over in his mind for a very long time and has finally, at some cost, made his peace with. "Timothy," she managed. Her voice was barely a sound. "You are cold," he said. "And you are bleeding above your left knee. Sit down, Ruth." She did not sit down. Her legs had gone entirely unreliable beneath her, but she stayed standing because sitting down felt like surrendering to something she had not yet earned the right to surrender to. "You know," she said. It was not a question. It was the dawning, terrible recognition that he had known before she came through that door, and possibly well before that. "I have known for some weeks," he said simply. She felt the blood leave her face. To understand how Ruth Crawford came to stand in that doorway with a confession dying on her lips, and a man's inexplicable grace leveled at her like the most disorienting weapon she had ever faced, you would have to go back to the beginning. Back to March of that same year, to a cold eastbound platform in San Antonio, where a woman with $37, a carpet bag, and a set of extremely well-constructed lies had made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of 2 lives. Ruth Crawford had not been born a liar. She had been born the second daughter of James Crawford, a land surveyor from Fredericksburg, Texas, a quiet, methodical man who had taught her to read survey maps before she could properly read books, and who had died in the winter of 1880, leaving behind a tangle of debts, 2 daughters, and a piece of land in the hill country that was worth considerably less than everyone had hoped. Ruth's older sister, Maggie, had married quickly after their father's death, moving east to her husband's family in Galveston. Ruth had stayed because someone had to manage the estate and because she had always been the stubborn one. For 2 years she had managed. She had sold the survey equipment. She had negotiated with the creditors. She had worked as a seamstress in Fredericksburg and later as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who paid her barely enough to cover her room and board. She had written careful, optimistic letters to Maggie that omitted the worst details. She had held on with both hands to the idea that she would find a way through. The way through, as it turned out, had come in the form of a newspaper notice. It was a small advertisement, tucked between a notice for a missing mule and a listing for blacksmith services in the back pages of the San Antonio Express. It read simply, rancher in Cutter's Creek, Blanco County, seeks a woman of capable temperament and honest character for purposes of partnership in land management. Correspondence welcome. T. Keating. Ruth had read it 3 times. She had not been the kind of woman who answered advertisements. She had, in fact, always considered herself slightly superior to the desperation implied by such a response. But she was 23 years old, she was nearly out of money. The dry goods merchant had just informed her that he was taking on his nephew instead of renewing her position, and the hill country winter had been brutal in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. She wrote back. The letter she composed was not precisely dishonest. It contained true things about herself. She was literate and numerate. She had experience managing accounts. She understood land surveys and property deeds, having grown up in a surveyor's household. She was in good health. She had no children and no encumbrances. What it omitted was the condition of her finances, the true state of her father's estate, and the fact that she had no viable land of her own to bring to any kind of partnership. The letter she sent implied, through careful arrangement of true statements and strategic silences, that she was a woman of modest but solid means, the daughter of an established hill country family, looking for an opportunity to expand what she already had. All of that was technically composed of true words. But the impression it created was a lie as clean and structural as any she could have built from pure fabrication. She received a reply within 2 weeks. Timothy Keating's letter was brief. It told her almost nothing about himself that she could not have guessed from the original advertisement. He confirmed he owned a cattle ranch of some 800 acres outside the town of Cutter's Creek, that he was 30 years of age, that he was in need of a capable partner in the enterprise of running it, and that he was prepared to offer room and board and a fair legal arrangement to the right person. He had asked her only one question in return. He had asked her if she was honest. She had paused over that question for a long time. Then she had written back and told him that she valued honesty above most things, which was also devastatingly true. The correspondence continued through February and into early March. His letters remained spare and functional, but there was something in the clarity of them that she found unexpectedly compelling. He did not make promises he could not keep. He did not embellish his circumstances or paint the ranch in colors it did not possess. He told her plainly that the work was hard, that the nearest town was 12 miles distant, that he had managed alone for 3 years since the death of his foreman, and that the arrangement he was proposing was a business one first and whatever else it might become second, and only if both parties found that agreeable. She respected that. She had taken the stage from Fredericksburg to San Antonio in the first week of March, caught the westbound rail line to Austin, and from Austin had hired a seat on a freight wagon heading toward Blanco County. The carpet bag held everything she owned that was worth carrying. The town of Cutter's Creek was not impressive. It was a single main street with a post office, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a church that sat at the far end like an afterthought, and a blacksmith who seemed to be the social hub of the entire community. It had a population of approximately 300 souls, which swelled somewhat during cattle drives and shrank considerably in the deep summer when the heat drove sensible people indoors. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of March, 1882, stepping down from the freight wagon into a street that smelled of horses and cedar smoke, and the particular dusty dryness that characterized the hill country at the end of winter. Timothy Keating had been waiting by the post office. She had known him immediately, though she could not entirely have explained why. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who do sustained physical work rather than intermittent labor, with dark brown hair worn somewhat long at the collar, and those unusual pale gray eyes that she would come to think of as his most defining feature. He was wearing a plain canvas coat and a hat that had clearly seen considerable use, and he held it in his hands when she approached rather than keeping it on his head, which she registered as a point in his favor. He had looked at her for a moment, said, "Miss Crawford," and then, after a brief pause, "You are younger than I expected." Said, "You are taller than I expected," which was not precisely relevant but had come out before she could stop it. Something had shifted slightly in his expression, which she would later identify as the closest Timothy Keating generally came to smiling in public. "The wagon is at the livery," he said. "The ranch is about 12 miles northeast. We should start before the afternoon light goes." That was how it began. The 12 miles to the ranch had been mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. He drove with the competent economy of movement that she would recognize as central to his entire character, neither wasting effort nor rushing anything. She had asked a few practical questions about the ranch and the cattle operation, and he had answered them precisely, without embellishment. She had told him something about her background with survey work, and he had listened with the focused attention of a man who was actually interested in what she was saying, which she found unexpectedly disarming. The Keating Ranch spread across a long limestone ridge above a small creek. The main house a solid two-story structure of cedar and limestone that someone had built with both durability and a degree of care that went slightly beyond the purely utilitarian. There were two outbuildings, a proper barn, a bunkhouse that was currently empty, and a vegetable garden that had gone to dry weeds over the winter but showed the bones of something once well tended. He had shown her the house with practical directness, telling her which rooms were which and where things were kept, and had indicated that the room at the top of the east staircase was hers, with its own door that locked from the inside, and that the arrangement of the house was hers to manage as she saw fit. She had stood in the doorway of that room, with its clean iron bed and its window that looked out over the cedar breaks toward a horizon that went on forever, and felt something complex and nameless move through her chest. It felt like possibility, which was, of course, precisely when the guilt had begun to solidify. She had managed the guilt for the first 3 weeks by staying extremely busy. The ranch accounts were, in fact, in worse shape than his letters had suggested, not through any dishonesty on his part, but simply because he was a man who was better with cattle than with ledgers, and the system he had been keeping was functional but inefficient. She reorganized everything within the first 2 weeks, identified 3 separate billing errors with a cattle buyer in Austin that had been costing him a steady small sum over the better part of a year, and wrote the corrective correspondence herself, which recovered enough money to cover feed costs through the spring. He had looked at the corrected ledgers with an expression she could only describe as wondering. "My father was a surveyor," she said, which was true. Numbers were important. "You are very good at this," he said. "I am very good at most things I decide to be good at," she said, another of those almost smiles. They developed a working rhythm quickly. She managed the accounts, the household, and the correspondence. He managed the cattle, the land, and the physical work of the ranch, though she was not averse to physical work herself, and he seemed to respect that. They ate dinner together most evenings, and the conversations that grew up around that table were the most substantive she had had in years. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence, which meant that when he did speak, she listened, and she had discovered that he had thoughts about things, considered and sometimes surprising thoughts, about land management, about water rights, about the changes coming to the Texas cattle trade with the expansion of the rail lines, about the treatment of the Comanche and the consequences of the reservation policies that had been imposed over the previous decade. That had surprised her most. She had not expected that from him. He was not a man who wore his politics loudly or who made a performance of his conscience. But he spoke with a quiet, direct seriousness about the displacement that had occurred in the same hill country where they were sitting, about what had been taken, about what the accounting of that would eventually look like. She did not always agree with every specific position he took, but she found the fact of his moral seriousness deeply affecting in a way she had not anticipated. She realized somewhere around the end of the 4th week, in serious danger. Not physical danger. The danger of beginning to care about a man she had deceived. The specific lie that most tormented her was the letter about the Harlan property. In their fourth week of correspondence back in February, Timothy had raised the question of the legal structure of their partnership. He had a ranch. He needed to know what she was bringing to the arrangement, practically speaking, to determine how a proper legal partnership agreement should be structured. It was a fair and reasonable question. She had panicked. The Harlan property was a 40-acre parcel adjacent to her father's old land in the hill country, owned by a distant Crawford relative named Edgar Harlan, who had died without a will or clear heirs in 1881. Ruth knew about the property because her father had surveyed it years earlier and had always talked vaguely about acquiring it. She had looked into it after her father's death and determined that the legal situation was complicated, that there were competing claims from Harlan's estranged family in Tennessee, and that the whole business might take years to resolve. But in her panic, she had written to Timothy that she expected to come into possession of the Harlan parcel within the year, as it was an estate matter currently being settled, and that she was prepared to incorporate it into their partnership arrangement as her contribution to the land base. Then she had fabricated a brief letter purportedly from her father's attorney confirming the broad outlines of this, and had enclosed it with her next correspondence to Timothy. She had forged a document. In her desperate, frightened, self-justifying state of mind at the time, she had told herself it would be fine, that the Harlan situation would probably resolve in her favor, that it was more of a prospective truth than an outright lie, that she would find a way to make it right. But here on the ranch, looking at Timothy Keating across the dinner table as he asked her a careful question about how her hill country contacts were progressing, she felt the lie like a physical weight against her sternum. By the fifth week, she had begun to look for ways to tell him. The problem was that she had discovered by that point that she did not want to lose this, not the arrangement, not the ranch, though she had come to love the limestone ridge and the cedar breaks and the wide, extravagant Texas sky. What she did not want to lose was him. There was an evening in late April when they had ridden out to check on the northern pasture fence line, which had taken a hit from a storm, and the repair work had taken longer than expected, and the sun had gone down while they were still out. They had sat on a flat limestone outcropping above the creek to let the horses rest, and the sky over the hill country had gone that particular series of purples and golds that felt almost deliberately excessive. And Timothy had said, without looking at her, that this was the thing that had kept him here when everything else had been hard, this specific sky, and she had understood him completely and absolutely. And something had shifted between them in the falling dark that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. She had not told him that night. She told herself she would tell him when the right moment came. The right moment kept not coming. Or rather, it kept presenting itself, and she kept recognizing that telling him the truth would end everything that was building between them, and she was a coward about it in a way she had not previously known herself to be. What broke the impasse was not her courage. It was Earl Dobbins. Earl Dobbins was the land agent for Blanco County, a heavy-set man with small, pale eyes and the professional skepticism of someone who had seen a great many land deals go sideways. He came out to the Keating ranch in the second week of May on what he described as a routine matter, but Ruth had enough experience with the language of bureaucratic men to recognize that there was nothing routine about his expression. He had come because the Harlan estate matter had, in fact, reached a resolution, and not in Ruth Crawford's favor. The Tennessee relatives had produced a valid will that predated the one Ruth had referenced in her letters to Timothy. The parcel was theirs. The estate was closed. More pressingly, Dobbins had been in contact with an attorney in San Antonio who had written to him querying the existence of a partnership claim on the Keating ranch, based on a letter of intent involving the Harlan property, and Dobbins had questions. Ruth had sat across from Earl Dobbins in the Keating front room and had answered his questions with the specific careful evasions of a person who has been doing this for long enough to be good at it, which was to say she had not precisely lied, but she had shaped the impression of the truth in a way that bought her time. After Dobbins left, she had gone to her room and had sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. Timothy had knocked on her door that evening. She had expected confrontation. He had known Dobbins was here. He had heard the conversation or enough of it. She had braced herself for the controlled, even voice she now knew meant he was managing something difficult, and for questions she did not know how to answer. He had simply said through the door that supper was ready when she was, and that nothing needed to be decided tonight. She had found that more frightening than an accusation. She had come down to supper. They had eaten in a silence that was nothing like their usual companionable quiet, and she had watched his face and understood that he knew more than she had told him, and that he was waiting, and that the waiting was something he was capable of in a way she was not. She could not sleep that night. She lay in the cedar-scented dark of her room and listened to the hill country making its night sounds, the Chuckwill's widow calling from the cedar brakes, the faint sound of the creek, the occasional shift of horses in the barn, and she made herself look at every single thing she had done without the softening lenses she had been wearing. She had come to this man under false pretenses. She had forged a document. She had allowed him to proceed on the basis of a lie that affected a legal and financial arrangement. She had let him begin to trust her, and she had done so knowingly, and she had kept doing it even after she knew that what was between them had become something real enough that deception was a genuine cruelty. She had gotten up before the dawn broke, dressed in the gray half-light, and left the house. She had walked. She had not taken a horse. She had needed the miles, needed the friction of the limestone caliche road under her boots, needed the sharp morning air and the gradual brightening of the sky to work through what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. And then she had been running, not because she was late, but because the waiting had become unbearable, and she had arrived at the door of the man she had deceived, and she had been ready to lay every terrible thing at his feet. And before she could apologize, he had said there was nothing here that needs forgiving. Now she stood in his front room with the sun fully up, with dust on her skirt and blood on her knee from a cedar branch she had not seen in the dark, and she tried to understand what he had said and could not get her mind around the shape of it. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was steadier now. "How long have you known all of it?" He picked up his hat and set it on the table again, a gesture she now recognized as what he did when he needed a moment to organize his thinking. "The attorney's letter came in April," he said. "I had already written to Fredericksburg myself in late March, to the county record's office. The Crawford estate situation was not difficult to find." She absorbed this. "You have known since April?" "Yes." "And you said nothing?" "No," he said. "I did not." She felt the heat of something complicated rise in her face. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the east window and caught the dust in the air between them, and she watched him work through whatever he was going to say with the deliberate honesty that was so central to his character that it made her own deceptions feel even more grotesque by contrast. "Because I wanted to understand the difference," he said, "between what you told me and what I knew, and because I wanted to see what you would do with the distance between those two things." She felt her throat tighten. "And what did you determine I would do?" "You ran 3 miles in the dark to tell me the truth," he said. "That is what I determined." She stood there for a long moment with that sitting in her chest. "Timothy," she said carefully because she needed to say this right, "the letter about the Harlan property was forged. I fabricated a document. That is not a small thing. That is fraud." "Yes," he said, "I know that. You cannot simply wave your hand and call that nothing." "I am not calling it nothing," he said, and something in his voice had shifted, had dropped lower and become something more precise. "I am telling you that there is nothing here that needs forgiving between the two of us. The legal matter is separate. The accounting of what you did to protect yourself, to survive, when you were out of options and afraid, that is something I understand well enough that I do not need you to perform a repentance for my benefit." She sat down. Her legs had finally made the decision for her. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, not close, at a respectful, careful distance, and looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she felt the full complicated weight of the preceding months settle around them like sediment coming to rest on the bottom of still water. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "All of it. Not because I needed to decide something, but because you have been carrying it alone and you do not have to anymore," she told him. It took nearly an hour. She told him about her father's death and the debts, about Maggie leaving, about the 2 years of holding on by her fingernails in Fredericksburg, about the advertisement and the desperate calculation she had made, about the Harlan property and the panic that had made her reach for a lie when she should have told the truth, about the forged letter and how she had justified it to herself at the time, about the weeks at the ranch and the accounts and the evenings at the dinner table and the night on the limestone outcropping when the sky went purple and gold, and how the lie had gotten heavier and heavier the more real everything else became. She told him all of it. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the reassurances that would have made it easier for her but would have broken the integrity of the accounting. He simply listened with his full attention in the way he always did, and when she was finished, the room felt different. Lighter and also heavier in different places, the way a room feels when a window has been opened in it for the first time. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "Is that all you have to say?" "Not quite." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, his hat still on the table beside him. "What do you want to do now, Ruth?" She blinked. "What do I want?" "Yes." His voice was entirely serious. "Do you want to go? I will help you find a situation. I know people in Austin. I can write letters that will get you placed somewhere respectable with good prospects. If you want to stay, the arrangement stands. What was valid between us about the work was real and remains real regardless of the land situation. But what you want matters to me, and I am asking." She looked at him for a long time. "What do you want?" she asked. "I would like you to stay," he said, and though his voice did not change in any theatrical way, there was something in those 6 words that landed in her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. She stayed. The weeks that followed were different from the ones that came before, different in the way a landscape is different after a long, hard rain, the same essential geography but cleaner, the creeks showing their true course, the limestone washed clear of the accumulated dust of ordinary days. She was still herself. He was still himself. But the absence of the lie she had been carrying changed the texture of everything between them, made it more permeable somehow, more honest in the small daily ways as well as the large ones. She began to say more of what she actually thought, and discovered that he found this not alarming but valuable. She told him when she disagreed with his approach to the summer grazing rotation, and made her case with the logic she had inherited from her surveyor father, and he argued back with equal seriousness, and they reached a compromise that was probably better than either of their starting positions. She told him that the bunkhouse needed a new roof before autumn, and that the expense was worth it because 3 good ranch hands would cost less than the damage an uncovered winter would do. He agreed, and they began the repairs together, working side by side in the early June heat. She discovered that he was not, in fact, as contained as he appeared. It was simply that his emotions operated at a depth that required patience to find. When the summer creek dried to a trickle in late June, as it did most years, he took it quietly and without complaint, but she noticed that he rose very early the next 3 mornings and spent time at the water sources with a focus that told her the worry ran more deeply than he expressed. She began to bring him coffee in those early mornings, without comment, and he received it without comment, and something passed between them in those quiet dawn hours that did not need to be named. She was thinking about naming it, actually, on the evening of the 4th of July, when the town of Cutter's Creek shot off its fireworks above the main street and half the county showed up to the church social that preceded them. She and Timothy had driven in together in the wagon, which everyone in town noticed and which Mabel Forsythe, the postmaster's wife, who served as the primary social recorder of the community, had noted with undisguised interest. Ruth had discovered that she liked the people of Cutter's Creek considerably more than she had expected to. There was a directness to hill country people, a lack of performative social ritual, that appealed to her practical nature. She had become friendly with Constance Ariola, who ran the general store with her husband Pedro, and who had a dry humor and an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone in the county that Ruth found both useful and genuinely entertaining. She had also become fond of the Reverend Marcus Webb, the elderly minister at the church, who had sharp eyes behind his spectacles and a habit of asking questions that turned out to be more interesting than they first appeared. At the church social, standing with a plate of potato salad and a glass of lemonade, while the Cutter's Creek fiddle players worked through a version of Old Dan Tucker that varied significantly from any version Ruth had previously heard, Constance Ariola had appeared at her elbow and said without preamble, "So are you going to marry Timothy Keating, or are you both going to be stubborn about it until you are 40? Ruth had nearly spilled the lemonade. "We have a professional arrangement," she said. "Ruth," Constance said patiently, "you drove in together. He has looked at you 17 times in the last 20 minutes. I counted. Pedro and I had a professional arrangement too, and now we have 4 children." Ruth looked across the church grounds to where Timothy was standing with Pedro Ariola and 2 other ranchers, engaged in what appeared to be a conversation about water rights, and he was, in fact, looking at her with an expression that he changed to something more neutral the moment he saw her looking back. She felt warmth move through her in a way that had nothing to do with the July heat. The fireworks went up over Cutter's Creek as the dark came fully in, blooming in red and white and blue against the enormous Texas sky, and the crowd oohed and called out, and Ruth was standing slightly apart from the main group when Timothy came to stand beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him in the summer night. They stood watching the sky light up. "Constance Ariola told me I was being stubborn," he said. Ruth looked at him. "She told me the same thing from the other direction." "She is probably right," he said. "She usually is," Ruth agreed. They watched another burst of light open against the darkness, white sparks raining down in slow arcs. "Ruth," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not really a response to a question he had not yet asked, but which somehow answered it anyway. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes full of fireworks and something that was not fireworks at all, and she thought about the months of careful distance, about the lie she had carried, about the morning she had run through the dark to confess it, about the grace he had met it with, about every evening at the table and every dawn with coffee, and every disagreement worked through to a better answer. And she thought that this particular human being was the most unexpected and most completely right thing that had ever happened to her. He did not say anything else with words. He reached out in the dark and found her hand, and she let him take it, and they stood together watching the sky over Cutter's Creek burn with light. In the weeks that followed, the nature of the thing between them became unmistakable to themselves, if not entirely formal yet. There were conversations that went late into the night on the porch when the heat finally broke enough to sit outside. Conversations that covered the length and breadth of what they each believed and wanted and feared. There was the evening when a late summer storm came down fast over the ridge, and they ran together from the barn to the house, arriving soaked and breathless and laughing, and he had stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with her hair entirely undone and wet from the rain, and the look on his face had been so direct and unguarded that she had felt it like a hand against her heart. There was the afternoon she had come across him sitting on the porch steps in the early evening, reading, which she had not seen him do before, and she had asked what the book was, and he had shown her. A worn copy of the complete works of Tennyson that he had clearly had for a long time. "I would not have thought you were a Tennyson man," she said. "What would you have thought?" she considered. "Something practical, something about land management or animal husbandry." "Those are in the study," he said. "This is for the porch." She had sat down on the step beside him, and he had read to her for an hour while the hill country evening did its gold and purple business on the horizon. And she had thought that she was going to love this man until she died, which was a thought that both terrified and settled her in equal measure. The question of the legal situation with the partnership arrangement had to be addressed, and they did so with the same practical directness they brought to everything else. Timothy had consulted with an attorney in Austin, a level-headed man named Hargrove, who had reviewed the situation and determined that the best course forward was to restructure the arrangement entirely on its actual merits rather than on the Harlan property claim that had never materialized. Given Ruth's demonstrable contribution to the ranch's financial recovery, there was a legitimate case for a proper partnership based on labor and management, which was the arrangement they formalized. The forged document itself was a more delicate matter. Hargrove had advised that the safest course was to formally withdraw the claim that had referenced it, which had never progressed to the point of legal action anyway, and to ensure that nothing was left in the record that could create future complications. This was accomplished quietly and without drama, and Ruth paid the legal fees from her own portion of the ranch accounts, which she felt was the right and appropriate thing to do. She told Timothy this when it was done. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a moment with that specific expression she had learned to read, the one where he was deciding how much of what he was thinking to say. "It is over," he said. "Leave it behind." She tried to take that fully in. It was harder than she had expected, not because he did not mean it, but because she had a tendency toward self-accounting that made it difficult to close a ledger that still felt unbalanced to her. But she was working on it. They were working on a great many things. September came in over the hill country with a gradual cooling, the light changing to something more golden and precise, the cedar breaks going a slightly deeper green against the pale limestone. The ranch was in the best shape it had been in years. The summer grazing had gone well. The accounts were clean. They had taken on 2 ranch hands, brothers named Clem and Roy Briggs from a family in the next county, who were quiet workers and respectful of the rhythm of the place. On a Saturday afternoon in early September, Timothy came to find her in the garden, which she had brought back from weeds to productivity over the summer, and which now produced enough to supplement their supplies through the winter. He was not in his work clothes. He was wearing his better coat and his hat was clean. She looked at him. "Come for a ride with me," he said. She brushed the soil from her hands and went to change. He took her to the limestone outcropping above the creek, the same one where they had sat the previous April watching the hill country sky do its particular extravagance. The horses were left below, and they climbed up to the flat rock where the view opened out over the cedar breaks to the far ridges and the endless sky. He had brought the Tennyson. They sat together for a while without speaking, and then he set the book down and turned to look at her with the full attention he brought to things that mattered to him. "I want to ask you something," he said. She met his eyes. Those pale gray eyes that she had initially found unreadable and now found entirely open to her. "Ruth Crawford," he said, "I would like you to marry me, not for the ranch, not for any arrangement, for the long conversation, for the years ahead of this, because I cannot think of anyone I would rather fight about grazing rotation with for the rest of my life." She felt her whole face do something she could not entirely control. "That is the least romantic marriage proposal I have ever heard," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that was not quite laughter but was first cousin to it. "Yes," she said, "that is absolutely a yes." He kissed her then, in the September afternoon on the limestone outcropping above the Keating Creek, with the whole hill country spread out beneath them, and the sky doing precisely the thing it always did at that hour. And it was not a tentative or careful kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who have waited long enough and know exactly what they are choosing. She had both her hands in his coat lapels, and he had one hand against her face and the other in her hair, and when they finally separated, they were both breathing somewhat irregularly. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She started to laugh, and he started to laugh, sitting on the limestone in the September light, and it was the best feeling she had had in longer than she could specifically locate. They were married in October of 1882, at the church in Cutter's Creek on a bright fall afternoon when the air smelled of cedar and the sky was the color of a blue that did not seem to believe in limits. Reverend Marcus Webb officiated with evident satisfaction. Constance Areola, who had predicted the whole thing, sat in the front pew with Pedro and all four of their children and looked magnificent in her self-justification. Mabel Forsythe from the post office wept in the pleasant and thorough way that people who love a wedding weep, and even Clem and Roy Briggs had cleaned up considerably for the occasion and sat in the back pew looking scrubbed and earnest. Ruth's sister Maggie had come from Galveston with her husband, arriving the day before on the Austin stage, and had stood in the ranch kitchen the evening before the wedding looking around at everything with an expression that Ruth could not entirely read. "You are happy," Maggie had said finally. It was not quite a question. "I am," Ruth said. Maggie had looked at her for a long moment and then had said, "Good, that is the thing I needed to see." The wedding was simple and true to both of them, which was to say it was not elaborate or performative but had something in it that felt entirely real, the way the best ceremonies do, not a performance of an intention but the articulation of something already long established. When Reverend Webb asked Timothy if he would take this woman, Ruth watched his face, and what she saw there was a certainty so quiet and absolute that it made her throat close for a moment. When it was over and they walked out of the church into the October afternoon, with rice and good wishes coming at them from all directions, Timothy had taken her hand, and she had thought again about the morning she had run through the dark in the scrub brush with her confession and her terror, and about those words that had met her in the doorway, and she thought that the thing he had said then was the kindest and truest thing anyone had ever said to her, because it had not been permission or absolution. It had been the simple statement of where he had already arrived on his own, by his own reckoning, long before she knocked on his door. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tells you what a marriage is actually made of. It came hard, which winters in the hill country occasionally do, with a January ice storm that closed the roads for a week and knocked down part of the barn roof and killed 2 of the cattle that had been caught in a low pasture when the temperature dropped. It was not a catastrophe, but it was not nothing either, and they moved through it together with the practical solidarity of people who have already established that they are on the same side. Ruth managed the accounts while he directed the repairs, and she was in the barn with him on the worst days, both of them in every coat they owned, working by lantern light to shore up the damaged walls. They came inside at night exhausted and smelling of cedar and cold air, and she made supper while he built up the fire, and after supper they sat close to the hearth, sometimes talking and sometimes in a comfortable silence that had nothing lonely about it. She had never particularly believed in the idea of a person as a home, finding it sentimental and imprecise. She revised this view over the course of that first winter. Timothy Keating had become, quite thoroughly, the place she lived. She told him this one night in February, sitting beside the fire with his shoulder under her head and his copy of Tennyson open in her lap, though neither of them were reading it. "That is the most romantic thing you have said to me since you agreed to marry me," he said. "I said a great many romantic things at our wedding. Those were prescribed by the ceremony. I am speaking of the voluntary ones." She smiled at the fire. "I will try to do better." "You are already doing perfectly well," he said, and pressed his mouth to her hair, which was the Timothy Keating version of poetic extravagance, and which she had learned to receive as exactly that. By spring, she was expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in March, 1 year nearly to the day after she had first arrived in Cutter's Creek on the freight wagon. She had planned to find the right moment, to say it with some degree of composure, but when she came to breakfast, and he looked up from the ledger he was reviewing, and said good morning in the quiet particular way he said it to her, she had simply sat down across from him and told him directly. The expression on his face was one she had never seen from him before and would never entirely forget. It moved through something like shock and something like awe and settled into something that she could only describe as a complete and unself-conscious joy. And Timothy Keating's unself-conscious joy was a spectacular thing because it happened so rarely and so entirely. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood up too, and he held her in both arms carefully, as though she were something irreplaceable, which she supposed from his perspective she was. "A baby," he said into her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. "In September, I think." "September," he repeated, as though he were placing it in the landscape of their lives. The pregnancy was not easy in the first months, and Ruth discovered that she found it deeply annoying to be unwell, which Timothy managed with a combination of practical helpfulness and a thoughtful refusal to suggest she should take things easier, knowing her well enough to understand that being told to rest was the fastest way to make her refuse to rest. He simply quietly ensured that the heaviest physical work had other people to do it, and kept the coffee pot full, and was present without hovering. She appreciated this profoundly and told him so. "I have been paying attention," he said. "You always have been," she said. The summer passed with the ranch and the pregnancy both progressing well. Ruth's body fascinated and occasionally infuriated her in approximately equal measure. She kept working, modified as she had to, and Timothy kept working alongside her, and they continued to have dinner every evening and sit on the porch when the heat allowed and read and argue about grazing rotation and water rights. And she continued to love him in the daily ongoing way that she had decided was the truest form of it. Not the dramatic moment, but the accumulated ordinary accumulation of chosen days. Maggie came from Galveston in August, arriving in time to help in the weeks before the birth. Having her sister in the house was both more and less complicated than Ruth had expected. More, because they had been apart for 2 years, and the distance between their situations had grown into a kind of gap that required some bridging. Less, because Maggie was fundamentally sensible and deeply fond of Ruth in the unsentimental way of older sisters who have worried about their younger sisters for a long time and are now cautiously relieved. Maggie and Timothy regarded each other with careful mutual assessment for the first 2 days, and then had a long conversation on the porch from which both emerged with evident respect for the other, which Ruth accepted as the best possible outcome. "He is not what I expected," Maggie told her. "What did you expect?" "A rougher version," Maggie said. "More of the country and less of the interior," Ruth smiled. "He surprised me too." Their son was born on the 3rd of September, 1883, after a long and difficult labor that Ruth managed with the same stubborn determination she brought to everything. And when it was over and the baby was placed in her arms, she looked at the small, red, furious face and felt something so overwhelming that she had no precedent for it. Timothy had been permitted into the room by the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Holt, who had been delivering babies in Blanco County for 20 years, once it was clear that everyone was safely through the worst of it. He stood at the bedside and looked at the baby with an expression that Ruth recognized as the same complete and unself-conscious joy she had seen when she told him it was coming, rendered now even more absolute. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. He looked at her. "You have been thinking about names longer than I have." "James," she said, "for my father." She watched his face. "If you agree." "James Keating," he said, testing the sound of it. "Yes." He reached out a single careful finger, and the baby turned toward it with the blind, instinctive interest of the newly arrived. And the look on Timothy Keating's face in that moment was something Ruth put in the permanent catalog of the best things she had witnessed in her life. James Crawford Keating grew into the sort of baby that kept his parents deliberately humble, being first colicky, and then relentlessly curious, and then, once he was mobile, a persistent small agent of household chaos. Ruth found motherhood almost nothing like what she had imagined, and entirely better in specific ways and more demanding in others, and she and Timothy navigated it with the same practical collaborative approach they brought to everything, which included genuine disagreements about some specifics and genuine admiration for each other's instincts about others. Maggie stayed for 2 months and then went back to Galveston, and the separation this time felt less sharp because the gap had narrowed. She and Ruth wrote to each other regularly now, actual letters, rather than the careful edited ones Ruth had sent before, and the correspondence was the better for it. The ranch continued to grow. The spring of 1884 brought a good calf crop and a fair price from the Austin buyers, and Ruth renegotiated the cattle contract on terms that improved their margin by enough to fund the expansion of the bunkhouse and the purchase of additional breeding stock. Clem and Roy Briggs were still with them and had been joined by a third hand, a young man from San Antonio named Ignacio Vega, who was extraordinarily good with horses and who young James, at 6 months old, watched with a wide fascination whenever Ignacio came anywhere near. The town of Cutter's Creek had opinions, as small towns do, about the Keating Ranch and the woman who ran it alongside the man who owned it, and the opinions were varied. Most people were fundamentally practical, and the evidence that the ranch was prospering under the current arrangement was too clear to argue with. A few of the older established families held views about the proper roles of women in the management of cattle operations that differed from the reality the Keatings were enacting, and these views were expressed occasionally and politely ignored. Ruth had an encounter in the general store one afternoon in the spring of 1884, when James was 7 months old, and she was there for supplies, that summed up the broader situation neatly. A cattleman from up the county named Harlow Price, who was one of the more prosperous men in the region and who had opinions about most things, had been at the counter when she arrived, and had addressed her with the particular combination of politeness and condescension that men of his type deployed with women they considered not quite in the right place. He had said something to the effect that it must be quite a thing for Timothy to have someone managing the paperwork so he could focus on the real work. Ruth had looked at him with the steady, unhurried patience she had learned from her husband. "Mr. Price," she said, "the real work is the one that keeps the enterprise financially viable and the contracts favorable and the accounts accurate. And I do that alongside the grazing management and the water planning and the correspondence with the buyers, which I also do. Timothy does the cattle work, which he is better at than I am, because we divide labor according to competence. But I appreciate your interest in our arrangements." Constance Areola behind the counter had maintained complete composure until Price left, at which point she had laughed with a thoroughness that shook the jars on the shelf behind her. Ruth told Timothy about it at supper. He listened to the whole thing with a perfectly straight face and then said, "Paperwork." "That was the word he chose," Ruth confirmed. Timothy thought about this for a moment. "I hope you were not too polite about it." "I was exactly the right degree of polite," she said. "Good," he said, and the look he gave her across the table was one that she had come to understand as the fully internal version of the almost smile, the one that went all the way to the back of those gray eyes, and it made her feel that particular warmth that living alongside someone who genuinely sees you tends to produce. James began walking at 11 months, which Ruth had documented with the careful precision of a woman who had been recording data all her life, and which Timothy received with the same wondering attention he had brought to every stage of the boy's development thus far. He was a deeply attentive father, not in the performative way but in the real way, the way that shows up in small dailies, in the patience with which he answered the questions of a newly verbal small person who had opinions about everything, in the way he included James in what he was doing around the ranch from the earliest possible age, carrying him in the crook of one arm while he checked fencing, pointing at things and naming them, building in the boy a vocabulary of the land that Ruth found beautiful to watch. The second pregnancy came in the winter of 1884 and was considerably easier than the first. Ruth told Timothy in December, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, which she found deeply satisfying, as though joy at its essential best was not something that diminished with repetition, but rather confirmed itself each time as equally real. Another one in September, she calculated. September seems to suit us, he said. This time Maggie came again from Galveston, arriving in August with her own 3 children in tow, which transformed the Keating ranch into something considerably more animated than its usual state. Timothy managed the influx with the equanimity that Ruth had come to regard as one of his finest qualities, and the house was loud and full and alive in a way that she found she loved, which surprised her slightly given that she had always considered herself a person who valued quiet. The second child arrived in September of 1885, a girl this time, which Ruth had privately suspected for several months on the basis of certain differences in how the pregnancy had gone. They named her Clara Jane, Clara for no specific reason except that it had sat right in Ruth's mind, and Jane for Timothy's mother, who had died when he was 12 and whom he spoke of rarely but with a particular gravity that told Ruth she had been important in a way that absence had not diminished. Clara Jane Keating arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, and was received by James, then exactly 2 years old, with a frank assessment that concluded in apparent approval, and by Timothy with the same unself-conscious joy that Ruth was beginning to understand was the truest and most consistent expression of who he was at the center of himself. "2," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed with Clara in his arms and James pressed against his side demanding to see. "2," Ruth agreed, watching the 3 of them. "It is a good number," he said. "It is," she said. Life on the Keating ranch settled into a new and fuller shape over the following years, the shape that comes when a family has found its particular rhythm and is living inside it. James grew into a serious, curious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's sharp precision with numbers, who had opinions about the cattle and about fairness, and about the proper way to make biscuits, all of which he expressed without hesitation. Clara was quieter but equally determined, with Ruth's brown hair and Timothy's capacity for deep attention, and a particular affinity for the horses that had Ignacio Vega shaking his head in admiration before she was 4 years old. Ruth continued to run the accounts and the contracts and the correspondence, and continued to argue with Timothy about the grazing rotation and the water strategy with the same productive friction that had always characterized their professional relationship, and continued to find that arguing with Timothy Keating was one of the more consistently rewarding activities available to her, because he was a fair and honest disputant who changed his mind when presented with better evidence and expected her to do the same. The ranch expanded again in 1886, when the property adjacent to the northern boundary became available at a price they could manage, and Ruth had run the numbers 6 ways and presented the case to Timothy with the same clear precision she brought to any analysis, and he had looked at the ledgers and then looked at her and said, "Yes," and she had felt the same satisfaction she always felt when a well-built argument reached its proper conclusion. The additional land improved their water access and opened up grazing options that had been constrained before, and the effect on the cattle operation over the following 2 seasons was measurable and significant. Ruth updated the accounts quarterly with the focused pleasure of someone watching a well-constructed plan play out, and Timothy rode the expanded range with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose land had become what he had always believed it could be. She found him out there one evening in the autumn of 1886, out on the new northern range, sitting on a fence post in the lowering light with his hat in his hands. She had ridden out looking for him because supper was getting cold, but when she saw him, she did not call out immediately. She stopped and watched him for a moment, this man she had married, sitting in the evening light of the hill country that he loved, looking out over land that was his because of work and patience and the slow, faithful accumulation of days. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Cutter's Creek with $37 and a carpet bag, and a set of well-constructed lies, and a core of fear that she had not even fully recognized at the time for what it was. She thought about the way grace can come at you from an unexpected direction and catch you entirely off guard, the way words can do an enormous work in 6 simple syllables. She rode over to him. He looked up when she came near, and the expression on his face in the evening light was everything she needed. "Supper is getting cold," she said. "I know," he said. "I was watching the light." "I know," she said. "Come home." He set his hat on his head and swung down from the fence and caught her horse's bridle, and they walked back together through the cedar breaks in the blue falling dusk, side by side. The years continued in the way of good years, with texture and incident and the accumulated richness of a life built in partnership. There was the terrible dry summer of 1887 that tested everyone in the hill country, when the creek went entirely dry and they hauled water for the cattle for 3 months and lost a portion of the herd despite everything. Ruth ran the financial analysis in the aftermath and determined they could absorb it without jeopardizing the expansion, which was a tight calculation but a true one, and Timothy received this assessment with the equanimity he brought to difficulty, and they moved through it together and out the other side. There was the winter of 1888 when James, now 5, had a serious fever that frightened them both more than either let on to the other at the time, and Ruth sat up with him through several nights while Timothy spelled her in the early hours. And when the fever broke and the boy looked up at his mother with clear eyes and asked if he could have something to eat, she had put her face in her hands and breathed for a long moment. And Timothy had put his hand on her back and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. James recovered completely and showed no further interest in being unwell, as though the experience had been a brief administrative error that he had corrected and moved on from. There was the autumn of 1888 when Constance and Pedro Arriola's oldest daughter, Lucia, who was 17 and one of Clara's closest friends despite the age difference, had a difficult situation with a young man from up the county who had treated her poorly, and Constance had arrived at the Keating ranch in a state of contained fury looking for Ruth, specifically, to talk to, which they did for 2 hours on the porch, and at the end of which Constance had said, "You are the most useful woman in Blanco County, Ruth Keating." "Crawford Keating," Ruth said. "Yes, that too," Constance said. Reverend Marcus Webb died in the spring of 1889 at the age of 73, which was a loss to the community of Cutter's Creek that was felt widely and deeply. He had presided at the Keating wedding and at the baptisms of both their children, and he had been one of the few people in the community who had spoken with consistent seriousness about the ongoing injustices of the land dispossession that had shaped the entire hill country, which Timothy had valued, and Ruth had found increasingly important as she understood more of the history of the place she had made her home. At Reverend Webb's memorial service, Ruth had sat next to Timothy in the church where they had been married, and had looked at the walls and the light coming through the plain windows, and had felt the weight of time in a way that was not melancholy, but was serious. The understanding that communities and lives are built by specific people who make specific choices, and that the debt to those people is paid by doing the same. She said something like this to Timothy on the drive home, and he had thought about it for a mile of road before he said, "Yes, that is right." A third pregnancy announced itself in the late summer of 1889, which was a surprise in the pleasant way, and which Ruth received with more equanimity and considerably less uncertainty than she had felt the first time, having by this point some confidence in her own capacity to sustain a pregnancy and her own ability to manage the additional labor of a new small human in the house. Timothy's reaction, the third time, was identical to the first two, which she found endearing beyond her ability to express it without becoming sentimental about it. "You are consistent," she said. "It is consistently extraordinary," he said. She reached out and touched his face, which was something she did when the love was particularly acute and words were not quite adequate, and he turned his face slightly and pressed his mouth to her palm, which was how he received that gesture, and it was a very small exchange but entirely theirs. The third child was born in June of 1890, another boy, who arrived faster than either of his predecessors and immediately established himself as the loudest person in the Keating household. They named him Thomas William, Thomas being a name they had both liked, and William for Timothy's older brother, who had gone to California in 1878 and was doing well there, and who wrote letters that were vivid and irregular, and always made Timothy smile in a particular way that told Ruth the brotherly affection ran deep even across the distance. James, at 7, received Thomas with a combination of big brother authority and genuine warmth that was entirely characteristic of him. Clara, at 4, decided immediately that Thomas was hers in some fundamental sense, and that the primary qualification she had for her role in his life was an intensity of affection that Thomas, once he was old enough to have opinions, appeared to entirely accept. The house was full now, full in the best sense, with the noise of children and the rhythm of work and the ongoing conversation of a marriage that had not run out of things to say. Ruth looked around at it sometimes with the deliberate attention of someone who has known enough uncertainty to never take what is good for granted, and she felt what she could only call sufficiency, a word she preferred to happiness because it was more accurate, the sense of having arrived at a place where the fundamental architecture of your life is sound. She said this to Timothy one night in the summer of 1890, lying in the dark after the children had finally gone quiet, with the hill country making its summer sounds through the open window. "Sufficiency," he repeated as though tasting the word. "Does that seem too businesslike?" she asked. "No," he said. "It seems precise." "You are always precise." A pause. "I think I would say gratitude." "For what specifically?" "For the morning you knocked on my door," he said. "For all of it, for you." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling in the dark. "Timothy," she said. "Yes. I am grateful too." She found his hand under the covers. "For what you said that morning. Do you remember exactly?" He was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps he had not kept the specific words. "I said there was nothing here that needs forgiving," he said. "Yes." She held his hand in the dark. "I have thought about that many times, about what it cost you to say it, about what it took." "It did not cost as much as you think," he said. "I had spent several weeks understanding why you did what you did. I had put myself in the situation of a woman alone, without resources, without family support, trying to survive in a world that does not make that easy, and I had asked myself what I would have done." "What did you conclude?" "That I might have done the same," he said, "or something like it." She thought about that. "You are a fair man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I do not always manage it." "You manage it more consistently than most," she said. "I have had enough opportunity to compare." He pressed her hand in the dark, and she pressed back, and the hill country went on with its summer sounds around their house and their family and their life, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The summer of 1891 brought a drought that affected all of the hill country, but the Keating ranch had enough water access from the expanded land purchase to weather it better than most of their neighbors. Timothy organized a cooperative arrangement with 2 neighboring ranches to share water access through the worst of the dry months, which was the kind of thing he did without fanfare or expectation of credit, and which Ruth included in the permanent accounting she kept of the reasons she had been entirely right about him. James turned 8 that September, and the celebration was a proper one, with the Areolas and the Briggs brothers and Ignacio and several families from the county coming out to the ranch for an afternoon that involved considerable food, a deal of music from a fiddle and a guitar that Pedro Areola played with surprising skill, and a general atmosphere of the kind of community satisfaction that accumulates when a place has established itself well. Ruth stood at the edge of the gathering with a glass of lemonade and watched Timothy in the middle of it, talking to Pedro about something, James at his side with a piece of cake. Clara leaning against his leg, and Thomas being passed between adults with the equanimity of a baby who had been socialized early. She watched this, and felt the particular quality of joy that is made partly of present gladness, and partly of the memory of how close she had come to none of it. She had come to this place with a lie and had been met with grace. She had built on that grace something real and lasting. She had not earned the grace, but she had tried, every day since, to deserve the life it had opened. Constance Areola appeared at her elbow. "You are doing the look again," Constance said. "What look?" "The look you get when you are being grateful about Timothy," Constance said comfortably. "You have been doing it for 9 years. It has not become any less obvious." Ruth smiled. "Is it embarrassing?" "It is, in fact, one of the more pleasant things I have seen regularly in my adult life," Constance said. "Don't stop." Timothy looked up from his conversation and found her across the gathering with those pale gray eyes, and the look he gave her from across the yard was private and specific. The way a look between two people can be entirely legible to each other and opaque to everyone else. She raised her lemonade glass slightly. He almost smiled. She thought, 9 years, 3 children, 800 acres expanded to nearly 1,200, one forgiven lie and 10,000 ordinary days that had accumulated into the specific irreplaceable shape of this life. She thought, it is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. The harvest of 1891 came in strong and the cattle prices held, and the winter that followed was mild in the way that occasionally happened in the hill country, cold enough to be right but not hard enough to do damage. They made it to spring intact, the family and the ranch and the long conversation they had been having for 9 years, and spring came over the limestone ridge the way it always did, extravagant with wildflowers and the loud opinions of the returning birds and the particular quality of light that made the cedar brakes glow an almost implausible green. Ruth stood on the porch one April morning in 1892 with coffee in her hand, watching James head down to the barn with his father to begin the day's work. James at 8 now, almost to Timothy's shoulder, asking something about the breeding stock in his earnest, precise way, and Timothy's hand on the boy's shoulder as he answered, and Clara coming out of the barn ahead of them, having got there first somehow, and Thomas running down from the house behind Ruth in his boots with his shirt untucked, because he had dressed himself and considered tucking the shirt an optional step. She caught Thomas by the collar as he went past and tucked his shirt in with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. "Mama," Thomas objected. "Go," she said and pointed. He ran. She watched him go. She drank her coffee. The morning light came over the ridge and touched the limestone and the cedar and the deep green of the irrigated garden and the barn red that had finally been painted on the outbuildings last fall. And the whole of it, the whole particular thisness of it, lay out before her in the April morning with the clarity of something fully possessed. She had arrived here with $37 and a carpet bag, and a lie she had told herself was not quite a lie. She had been met with grace. She had built here with this man this life. She thought about the moment in the doorway, the confession dying on her tongue, and his voice saying those words that had changed the shape of her world. There is nothing here that needs forgiving. She had thought at the time that it was grace given freely. She had come to understand, over the years, that it was something more complex and more earned than that. It was the result of a man who had taken the trouble to understand before he judged, who had sat with her actions and her context and her fear, and had arrived at a conclusion that was both more generous and more honest than simple absolution. It was the conclusion of someone who believed that people are the sum of their circumstances as well as their choices, and that circumstances matter in the accounting. She had spent the years since trying to live up to that understanding, to be the person the grace had assumed was possible. She thought, on balance, that she had made a fair job of it. Timothy came back up from the barn an hour later, the children staying behind with some task he had set them, and found her still on the porch with her second cup of coffee. He came up the steps and stood beside her looking out over the same view. "All right," he said. "Very all right," she said. He took the coffee cup from her hand and drank from it, which was something he did because he knew it mildly annoyed her and because she permitted it. "The calves are coming along well," he said. "Good. Ignacio thinks the northern pasture can support more head this summer. I saw his note. I think he is right. I ran the numbers yesterday." "What did they say?" "That we can expand the herd by 15% without overgrazing the summer grass, assuming the precipitation stays close to average." He handed her coffee back. She drank it. "Ruth," he said. She looked at him. His profile against the morning, the familiar planes of his face, the gray at his temples now that had not been there when she first arrived, the lines around his eyes that were the record of years spent in the hill country sun and wind. "What?" she said. He turned to look at her, and in his face was everything. The years and the children and the land and the long conversation, and the morning in the doorway and the limestone outcropping, and the July fireworks and the October wedding and the winter fires, and all the ordinary days stacked and accumulated into this specific irreplaceable person. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to say your name." She looked at him for a moment, and she felt the love so entirely that there was nowhere else to put it. "Timothy Keating," she said. "Ruth Keating," he said. It was enough. It was more than enough. The hill country morning went on around them, all cedar and limestone and impossible sky, and the children made noise in the barn, and the cattle were coming along well, and the accounts were accurate, and the long conversation was not anywhere near finished. It had barely, in fact, begun.